New cards means new review, and we're going to kick things off here with PLAGUEMAW the Rotting, a 4-mana, 3/4 legendary for Druid. After a friendly minion with Taunt dies, summon a new copy of it without Taunt. So, yeah, we're seeing some Taunt stuff here teased for Druid. I always liked old school Taunt Druid, but this card's pretty interesting because doesn't actually give you taunt minions. It gives you taunt minions without taunt, which is intriguing for sure. But I think the idea here for PLAGUEMAW is, you got a couple taunt minions on board, and you drop PLAGUEMAW basically behind your taunts. And if the opponent can't snipe PLAGUEMAW from behind those taunts, then when they clear your taunts, you're basically going to get a couple minions out of PLAGUEMAW. Now, they're not going to be taunt minions, so this isn't going to like chain infinitely, of course, which is why you have to have this condition. Otherwise, they'd summon a taunt minion, it would die, it would summon a taunt minion, etc., etc. But that's okay, because there are still minions where taunt's not the only upside, right? It's not their only effect. Think about a card like Archspore Mishafin, for instance, the prime minion for Druid. He's still going to have Death Rattle, add Mishafin Prime to your deck when he gets resummoned off of PLAGUEMAW. So even if your opponent clears it, they're still going to have that 3/4 lingering behind that's going to shuffle another prime minion into your deck. And there are other great examples, I'm sure, of taunt minions. Actually, Greybow is a good example. Greybow has a Death Rattle effect too. So even if they clear Greybow, PLAGUEMAW would summon another one that still has the really cool Death Rattle. It just doesn't have taunt again. And that could be a real pickle for your opponent if they get in this scenario where you just get all this extra value off of the back of PLAGUEMAW, create some Greybow chains, God knows what else could be a possibility. Now, the problem, of course, for PLAGUEMAW for me is that if it doesn't get sniped part, because really you're giving your opponent all the opportunity to just deal with PLAGUEMAW first. And, there will be, select decks that have to trade with minions and don't have 4 damage to go over the top and hit PLAGUEMAW first. But there won't be that many. There will still be so many decks that can just use some kind of removal spell on PLAGUEMAW or Battlecry or whatever it is, and snipe this guy and not really add any additional value on the back of PLAGUEMAW. So will PLAGUEMAW be worth it? And in particular, if you think about if you're playing all these taunt minions, you're trying to get all this value, you're probably a slower deck, you're probably hoping to stall out aggro decks, and they might just ignore PLAGUEMAW. Maybe they just push through that one taunt that you have and they don't care about the value you're going to get off the second Mishafin or whatever, because they're just ending the game. They're just going to go face really hard, and PLAGUEMAW is not a taunt, so who cares, right? The fact that the new ones don't have taunt is maybe they just don't care about PLAGUEMAW. He's not really a threat much at all. He's going to be a threat more in control matchups, and then in control matchups, they're way more likely to have an answer to PLAGUEMAW because they're not going to have to rely on minion trading to deal with things so readily. So it does feel like, he might have some problems here where he's not that great against aggro. He's not that great against control. So where does he really fit in, and how are you going to make PLAGUEMAW work in scenarios where he gives you enough return to be worth running in your deck and be worth spending 4 mana here on an understated minion? So, there is this alternative world where you have like taunt minions on board already, and you're the one trading them in, and you can kind of guarantee that your PLAGUEMAW goes off, but that just doesn't seem like that likely of a scenario. Like, you're ahead on board with taunt minions, you're trading them in. Taunt minions are usually going to have higher health totals than attack totals. It's like they're going to be taking weird trades. It's going to be hard to kill them off. It just seems awkward to me. Feels like the upsides here are really limited and going to be tough to pull off, and the susceptibilities for this card are just way too high. So, I want to dream big. I want this to be awesome. Like, I would love this kind of deck to work with. The idea of multiple Greybows and Mishafins and all these crazy taunts bouncing around, it's like a dream for me. Don't get me wrong. But I just don't know how to get PLAGUEMAW to make sense in that world and be a really valuable asset. It just seems like it's going to die, or it's not going to pay off, and it's just not going to be worth the card slot in your deck. I'm sad to say, I think this card looks kind of weak. All right, so up next here we have Guff, Rune Totem, the mercenary for Druid. Beautiful card here. What a nice little bird. It's a 3-mana 2/4. It reads, after you cast a nature spell, give another friendly minion +2/+2. So, yeah, if you squint really, really hard at this, you might see traces of Edwin Van Cleef. Already heard it called Edwin Van Leaf. It's very amusing, everybody. because it is a 3-drop that increments stats by 2/2, but of course, very, very different in function. So really the idea here with the Guff Rune Totem is you plop it on board, you have to have another friendly minion on board with it. Guff is not going to be buffing itself. You start chaining nature spells, say nature studies, for instance, which I might argue isn't actually a nature spell. I guess we don't know yet, but you're studying, not casting a spell. So that one's kind of been a given for people. I'm not quite as convinced. Is studying nature or not actually a nature spell? We'll find out. But I think regardless, Druid's gonna have a ton of very cheap nature spells available, and they might toss nature studies in there because it's got some green glowy stuff going on as well. So for the sake of it, I'm sure it'll be nature as well. So yeah, I think Druid will have a lot of 1 mana and certainly even more 2 mana spells that you can bounce off with Guff Rune Totem. So if you're in the mid to late game, play Guff, play a cheap minion of any kind, 1/2 mana, and maybe get 3 to 4 nature spells and gain a ton of stats. And then, of course, if Guff sticks around at all for a future turn, you can spend more mana, or you can cheese stuff out with Omu and do some crazy things. Yeah, you could build yourself a really gigantic board on the back of Guff Rune Totem. And we've already seen some teases of like taunt buff stuff with Mark of the Spike Shell. So maybe there's some world where we're playing taunt minions and buffing them and trying to create a big stat wall of taunts on the back of Guff and some of these other cards. So in theory, I think that's pretty cool, but I do have to say, in execution, I have a feeling it's going to be a little bit more awkward. There's a lot of moving pieces here to get Guff working. Essentially, you got to have this and another minion that's already kind of 2 cards to get this engine started. And then you have to have all these nature spells in hand. So that's, you know, again, maybe not necessarily hard, but they got to be the right mana cost. You've got to be at enough mana to make all this work. It feels like you could be sitting on 3 or 4 cards in hand half the time, just waiting for this big Guff blow up turn. And by the time you get it all put together and it's going to really make a ton of sense, might be too late by then. So I wonder if all those restrictions are basically just going to clog you up and slow you down and make Guff feel more awkward than particularly rewarding. I think for this card to really, really shine, you're probably going to have to put these stats on things that are making an impact in the game. So taunt minions, like we talked about, maybe some rush minions could make sense as well, so that you can take swings immediately off of these stats. But I sure want this card to work. I love the look of it. This is totally my vibe here for Guff. So I hope it takes off, but I do have some concerns. So moving on here to Razormane Battle Guard. Here's one of those taunt synergy cards I guess we've been looking for. It's a 2 mana 2/3, and it reads: the first taunt minion you play each turn costs 2 less. So basically here, the Razormane Battle Guard kind of just lets you play a 2/3 for free. If you were going to play a taunt anyway, you're on 4 mana, you got a 4 mana taunt. You play the Razormane Battle Guard, and boom, you still get to play your 4 mana taunt. You're up a 2/3. And the interesting part is this is kind of hidden behind that taunt. So if your opponent can't easily deal with that big stat bump all at once, then this might live and survive to play a future taunt at a discount, which could allow you to cheese, you know, quite a bit of extra mana over the course of the next turn or 2, which would definitely make the Razormane Battle Guard worth it, I think. It might be worth it anyway, just cheese out some extra 2/3 for free anytime you play a taunt. I think it's a neat little card, right? It's kind of reminds me a little bit of Foxy Fraud in a way, where you're just kind of getting that body on board and still getting to do what you want. Foxy Fraud has additional benefits of things like setting up combo and triggers on cards like Edwin and stuff that Razormane Battle Guard may not have quite as much benefit for, but still, it's a 2/3. And when you're playing with Druid, which has a lot of board buffs, and, you know, we've already looked at Guff, maybe this is just another body on board that kind of lingers around for Guff and these other follow-ups. I don't totally hate this card. I'm still not, you know, convinced Taunt Druid is a thing necessarily, and I don't think PLAGUEMAW helps the deck a lot, so part of it just feels like it's going to be a miss. But there's nothing inherently wrong with Razormane Battle Guard. So if you're running a handful of taunts in your deck, maybe this card's enough to help you keep up in those early to mid-game tempo fights against more aggressive decks for sure, and it indeed has some additional upside along the way as well. So moving on here to Firemancer Flurgle for Shaman. This guy's crazy looking at me. I don't know what it is with his heart, but it's really funny looking. He's a 2-mana 2/3 Murloc, and he reads, after you play a Murloc, deal 1 damage to all enemies. So this is kind of like Altruist for Demon Hunter, but it's Murloc based instead for Shaman, and only 2 mana. So theoretically, right, you get this guy down and you play really just even a couple or 3 Murlocs, and you're probably going to chunk away your opponent's board, swing the board back in your favor, and create a pretty nice board of your own, because you're not sacrificing really too much in stats here for Flurgle. He's vanilla stat line, and then, you know, hopefully your other Murlocs are building on that as well. We did lose some Murlocs. We haven't seen a lot of Murlocs for Shaman yet. We did see a buff. Hopefully there's more Murlocs coming to really support this. Otherwise, Flurgle's going to be stranded for a bit. But I trust we're going to get cards to help enable this Murloc Shaman archetype. In which case, Flurgle just makes sense, right? He's really good at helping you take back a board. Or sometimes just chipping in damage. Maybe just that 3 to 4 damage going face is all you really need to set up a win and find your lethal. So Flurgle can do both of those, much like Altruist. And of course, we saw Altruist was one of the swingiest, craziest cards ever in Hearthstone. I think he just could absolutely steal games sometimes. Now, I don't think Flurgle has quite that much potential, because Altruist was doing things like playing 0 mana Twin Slices, if you remember, and all these crazy, cheesy, low-cost Demon Hunter cards. Murlocs, on average, aren't going to be quite that easy to pop off, although I think we're getting Murloc Tiny Fin back in the core set, so you may actually technically have some 0 mana Murloc action if you want with Tiny Fin, but still it won't be as consistent or reliable as the crazy pop-offs from Altruist. But I don't think it needs to be necessarily either. Demon Hunter was using that to try to end games. I think you're going to use Flurgle to try to build counter boards more, or stabilize a board, or just really lock your opponent out of a game. So I don't think it has to go for like 6, 7, 10, 15 damage or whatever you're doing with Altruist. I think, you know, if you get 3 out of this, you might be a pretty happy camper just to help vie for a mid-game board state on the back of Flurgle. And that means this is a cool card, pretty solid little guy. I think clearly a lot of upside, as long as we see more Murloc Shaman support. Moving on here to the Warsong Envoy, a new 1 mana 1/3, and it's got Frenzy, gain +1 attack for each damaged character. So right off the bat, 1 mana 1/3, I mean, that's the stat line we know we can trust in Hearthstone. These have seen play so often, and this guy's not going to stay at 1 attack in many cases, because as soon as he survives damage, he's going to gain attack. So this does read each damaged character. Keep that in mind. That means he will proc off of himself. He will also proc off of heroes that have already taken damage as well, and of course, any other minions on board. So theoretically, I guess there's 14 minion slots and 2 hero slots, so he could go up to 17 attack if the entire board was damaged when he took damage. And remember, Frenzy is a one-time effect. He's not going to get frenzied multiple times. Now, clearly, that's not ever really going to happen. Maybe somebody out there will do it. That's on the bingo card or something. But realistically, if this is, you know, played on turn 1 and, you know, your opponent plays a 1/1 or something, you trade it in, he might just be a 2/2 after that, because he might be the only damaged character on board. Or maybe they play a 1/2 and he trades in and he can become a 3/2 in that scenario because he damaged the other character. Maybe somebody's taking a face hit and this is more like turn 2 or 3 when he gets damaged, and maybe, you know, he's like a 4/2 or something. Or maybe you follow him up with your own support. Maybe you got like a Cruel Taskmaster or something, which I'm not even sure is still in the core set, but you get the idea. Some sort of follow-up card, and you proc him yourself, and you get yourself like a 3/2 or 4, probably a 4/2, I guess, in that scenario. Right away, and he's this like super aggressive early minion that just hits face really hard. And when you consider that, and Cruel Taskmaster is in core set, so that's definitely an on-curve possibility here. I think this card's pretty intriguing. I think 1 mana 1/3 is fine. And if you're playing a more aggressive playstyle and you want the opportunity to occasionally chip in some extra damage, and you have, you know, some frenzy procs, and you have Cruel Taskmasters, or I don't think we have Inner Rage anymore, but those sorts of cards, right? This becomes nuts, right? It's a real possibility. I think there's even like Shield of Honor still in the game as well. So I think this will be a great starter card basically on turn 1. It's just, even if nothing happens to it, I think you're pretty good to go. And then if you support it with other crazy stuff, you follow it up, it's going to get even nuttier. So I think great at a base level. Follow-ups on it could be monster. This looks like a really, really strong option for Warrior to me to open games. So next up here is Sigil of Silence, a new 0-mana Demon Hunter card. It's another Sigil. We already saw one that dealt some damage. This one, as you might guess from the name, is going to silence. So at the start of your next turn, silence all enemy minions. And if you need a reminder, when you play this, it's going to pop up on your hero, kind of like a secret, but it's a secret that both characters, both players can read. So it's a known secret, basically. And then at the start of your turn, it's going to proc, and it'll silence all enemy minions. So I think the idea with this one is, right, like, oh, I'm going to try to hit them for lethal next turn. I've assembled a ton of damage. I want to make sure I can go face. So even if they play a bunch of taunt minions, it doesn't matter because I'm going to silence all of their taunt minions off of the Sigil of Silence, and I'm going to be able to whack them really hard with either my face or charge minions or whatever, because Demon Hunter still has charge minions. So it's kind of like a Kayn you can play preemptively if you know you're going to go for lethal. Now, of course, there are other applications outside of that. You could just play this on any given turn if you think your opponent's going to play some like key turn, like they're going to Guardian Animals, you know they're going to have a stealth minion on board, the stealth tiger that's going to try to draw them cards. You might say, well, no, look, I don't want them, having that stealth minion. I'm just going to deny that stealth and make sure I can kill it next turn. So I'm going to deny their Guardian Animals turn by playing a Sigil of Silence. And then maybe they decide not to play Guardian Animals. They have a weaker turn. So you've either stalled out their game plan, or if they go down their path and aren't paying attention, you get to silence their minions. So, some tricky kind of like, I'm going to try to stall you out or block your turns or ruin your turns sort of scenario here. Same thing with like Librams. They may have to hold off on playing Librams for a turn because they don't want to see them silenced, and you played a Sigil to discourage that. So you might be able to use this to kind of jostle for good scenarios to happen in game, or like small incremental advantages, or just use it for that big crazy blow up turn. Now, the problem, of course, is that you are giving the information to your opponent, and they're going to be able to make decisions perhaps better than you are by kind of guessing what's going to happen or assuming what they're going to do. And I think that's risky when you give information to your opponents. It's always potentially a downfall, unless it's that lethal scenario, or maybe it doesn't matter and they can't really do anything. But that makes the card a little bit weaker in my eye. They kind of have the advantage in any scenario when you play this card. It's also just got that 0-mana card thing where there will be matchups and game states where this just doesn't really do anything at all, and you drew a card that's pretty dead. So I don't know that every deck's going to be able to run this. Like an aggro deck might be the best one because they want to make sure they have that lethal setup turn guaranteed, but they also just don't want to draw a 0-mana card early in the game that's kind of sitting there not doing anything that they have to wait 5 or 6 turns to utilize, because it might bust their curve and they may not get to that lethal scenario anyway. So really just questions about whether decks can afford to run such a low impact card at the end of the day. Like, yes, it can be high impact, but it's very, very situational and limited for those scenarios when it's gonna shine. And if it's bad in every other scenario, might not be good enough. But still a pretty intriguing design. I like this card a lot, even if it doesn't get played a ton. It's a fun Hearthstone card design, and a strategically rewarding one in a way too. All right, so finally here we have the Paralytic Poison. I love this so much, this dude putting poison on his hammer. As I recall, this might be a reference to old school WoW stuff. I think there was like some stun hammer thing that rogues did. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, it's a 1-mana nature spell here for rogue. It gives your weapon +1 attack, and your hero is immune while attacking. So you play a Paralytic Poison, and man, you can take a lot of great trades as rogue, clearing off tons of minions without taking any damage. It's a bit reminiscent of the Uldum quest reward, where you could use that weapon to attack stuff and not take damage, which I have to admit, there was never a great Burgle Rogue, Quest Rogue there that came out of that card, but it did feel awfully good to have that weapon equipped and be able to clear stuff without taking damage, because Rogue is pretty sensitive to losing health over the course of the game as a class that doesn't have a ton of healing or taunt access historically. So a card like this, if you are planning to trade a lot, sounds pretty cool. Now that said, Rogue hasn't really been trading a lot lately. In fact, Rogue's mostly been going exclusively face. And with cards like Nitro Boost Poison and all the stealth cards and all the just crazy Rogue damage output right now, I don't think the way we see Rogue today has a lot of room for Paralytic Poison, just because the upside of this immunity is not really relevant to their game plan. Only if they're ever like forced to hit a taunt would it matter. And they're not expecting games to go long enough for their health total to be a relevant concern anyway. You know, maybe it buys them like one extra turn on occasion to find lethal, but most of the time they're ending the game or losing really decidedly because their opponent stabilized and denied them. And this is unlikely to create breakpoints that made a big difference in winning or losing a game. Now, that said, we did see kind of a tease that Nitro Boost Poison might be getting nerfed to 2 mana. There was like a deck list revealed for like the returning players or something, and it listed Nitro Boost at 2 mana instead of 1. If that indeed comes true and Nitro Boost loses a lot of its power, I don't think it's nearly as good at 2 mana. It's still probably okay, but that deck may not be the best deck. And of course, as we just change metas and we shift and we lose, classic and basic, eviscerate going away, those sorts of things, that deck may not shine anyway. I see some openings for Paralytic Poison is what I'm getting at. Because here's the thing, this is not just immunity. I think if it was just immunity, this card wouldn't be very good. It would be like, oh, I just don't really care that much about immunity. I care way more about the weapon stats. But it's also giving attack. So it's not like you're not benefiting from an attack standpoint here with Paralytic Poison. I think the attack is still relevant and it still adds up. And that might just be enough to make Paralytic Poison a relevant option. I still don't think it'll be better than a 2-mana Nitro Boost Poison because clearly that's just a ton of damage output. But Rogue might have to slow down a little bit because they lost all the crazy efficiency of the current weapon Stealth Rogue. And if they start to slow down in any meta, any future meta, Paralytic Poison starts to look a little bit more intriguing every time because perhaps they're trading more to stabilize a board. And Paralytic Poison helps them do that. It buys them a couple extra turns over the course of a game. And if you have high durability weapons in particular, this card starts to shine. So I don't want to close the door on Paralytic Poison at all. I think it's got some real opportunities. Now, the most important aspect of this card, I think, is probably the fact that it's a 1-mana spell, much like Yoink. Rogue had a pretty crazy 1-mana spell pool. Again, if Nitro Boost changes, maybe that's not the case. But cards like Wand Thief are going to be completely bonkers for Rogue. Adding cards like Paralytic Poison and Yoink to the pool of 1-mana spells is going to matter and be relevant to the game, even if they're not played directly. They are still important cards to exist because of disrupting that 1-mana Rogue pool potentially. PLAGUEMAW the Rotting is a 2-star card. Firemancer Flurgle is a 4-star card. Guff Rune Totem is a 3-star card. Warsong Envoy is a 4-star card. Sigil of Silence is a 3-star card. Paralytic Poison is a 3-star card. Razormane Battle Guard is a 3-star card. And there you go. That wraps it up for review number 7, I think. Of course, as always, share your thoughts on these cards. I hope I didn't hate on PLAGUEMAW too much. I'm just not seeing it line up. But if you guys think it has a lot of potential, of course, share those thoughts down below. I want to hear it all. Hear your crazy takes or your really smart takes, whichever it might be. But until then, of course, thanks as always for watching. And until next time, game on.